The Criterion of Truth, a Quranic deconstruction of state-sanctioned abuses and judicial fabrications. Across modern authoritarian Muslim-majority states, a profound structural divergence has emerged between medieval juristic tradition and the foundational ethics of the Quran itself. Contemporary regimes deploy religious police, penal codes, and state machinery to enforce strict social control. Yet an objective textual analysis reveals that these abuses find no legitimacy in the Quran alone. They are rooted entirely in the external corpus of medieval Hadith literature and classical fiqh. When a state transitions from a Quran-centric framework, which prioritizes human agency, proportionality, and absolute freedom of conscience, to a Hadith-dependent legal framework, the foundational principles of justice are radically altered. First, facial hair laws and state grooming mandates. In authoritarian regimes from the Hindu Kush to the Zagros, state religious police actively monitor, detain, and physically assault men for shaving or trimming their facial hair. This mandate is derived entirely from isolated commands in the canonical Sunni Hadith collections. In Sahih al-Bukhari, the Prophet is reported to have commanded, "Cut the mustaches short and leave the beard as it is." Classical jurists took these stylistic, context-dependent instructions and codified them into binding religious law, classifying a clean-shaven face as a punishable sin. The Quran only fact-check. The Quran contains absolutely zero legal mandates regarding facial hair. The Arabic word for beard lihya appears exactly once in the entire text, positioned purely within a historical narrative. In Surah Taha, chapter 20, verse 94, Aaron pleads with his brother Moses, saying, "O son of my mother, do not seize me by my beard." Under a strict Quranic paradigm, facial hair is a matter of biology and personal grooming, entirely devoid of state jurisdiction or spiritual penalty. Second, female autonomy, forced veiling, and freedom of movement. Women living under strict Islamist legal systems face severe restrictions on basic civil liberties, compulsory face and hair veiling, institutionalized male guardianship known as kafala or mahram laws, and explicit bans on obtaining passports, working, or traveling independently. The denial of basic physical autonomy to adult women is directly tethered to prophetic oral traditions. In Sahih Muslim, it is recorded, "It is not permissible for a woman who believes in Allah and the last day to travel a distance of 1 day and night except with a mahram, a male guardian." This single text serves as the foundation for modern laws requiring women to obtain written permission from a father, husband, or brother to exit their homes or cross international borders. The Quran only fact-check. The Quran consistently addresses women as fully independent financial, spiritual, and legal agents who possess uninhibited freedom of movement. The text contains no concept of a male handler or guardian controlling an adult woman's mobility. Regarding dress, the Quranic modesty directives in Surah An-Nur chapter 24, verse 31 instruct women to draw their existing head covers, the kamar, over their exposed chests. The text explicitly leaves the face, hair, and hands unrestricted, framing modesty as a mutual social contract rather than a one-sided state lockdown enforced by physical coercion. Third, women's education and the state's war on learning. Across the Afghan highlands, the state has enacted a total gender-based ban on education. Girls over the age of 12 are forbidden from attending secondary school. Women are barred from universities. Nearly 1.5 million girls have been deliberately deprived of schooling since the ban, and roughly 80% of school-age girls now receive no education at all. The religious justification invoked for this exclusion traces directly to the Hadith corpus. In Sahih al-Bukhari, the Prophet is reported to have said that women are deficient in intelligence and religion, and that their testimony is worth half the testimony of a man. Medieval jurists seized on this single report to construct a legal doctrine of female intellectual inferiority, and modern theocratic states now deploy that doctrine to lock women out of the classroom and the library. The Quran only fact-check. The very first revelation of the Quran is an imperative to read. Surah Al-Alaq chapter 96 verse 1 read, "In the name of your Lord who created." The same revelation closes by praising the pen and the teaching of humanity what it knew not. The Quran commands knowledge without any distinction of sex. Surah Az-Zumar chapter 39 verse 9 say, "Are those who know equal to those who do not know? Only people of reason take heed." And Surah Taha chapter 20 verse 114, "My Lord, increase me in knowledge." The Quran never conditions the pursuit of learning on gender. The exclusion of girls from the classroom is a juristic invention with no textual foundation, standing in direct opposition to the Criterion's very first command: read. Fourth, capital punishment for dissent, blasphemy, and apostasy. Across the subcontinent, the Central Plateau, and the Arabian Peninsula, individuals face state-sanctioned execution, long-term imprisonment, or lethal mob violence for exercising freedom of thought, criticizing religious dogmas, or formally leaving the Islamic faith. The standard legal justification for killing ideological dissidents comes directly from explicit declarations in the Hadith corpus. In Sahih al-Bukhari, the Prophet is recorded as saying, "Whoever changes his Islamic religion, then kill him." This is reinforced by another canonical tradition stating that a Muslim's blood can be lawfully spilled if they become the one who leaves his religion and separates from the community. The Quran only fact-check. The Quran documents the reality of people changing their minds about faith multiple times, but never prescribes a worldly, secular, or physical punishment for apostasy. Instead, it establishes absolute freedom of conscience as a divine decree. Surah An-Nisa chapter 4 verse 137 states, "Those who have believed, then disbelieved, then believed, then disbelieved, and then increased in disbelief, never will Allah forgive them." If the legal penalty for the initial act of apostasy was death, a person would physically have no opportunity to flip-flop between belief and disbelief multiple times. This perfectly aligns with the grand cosmic declaration of Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 256. "There is no compulsion in religion. The right direction is now distinct from error." Fifth, corporal punishment and extrajudicial executions. The deployment of gruesome public executions, specifically stoning, rajm for sexual misconduct, remains a symbolic cornerstone of ultra-conservative Sharia penal codes. The mandate to stone citizens to death is completely absent from the text of the Quran and relies entirely on Hadith reports. In Sahih Muslim, extensive narratives detail the Prophet ordering the public stoning of a married woman who voluntarily confessed to adultery. Medieval jurists used these narratives to overwrite the explicit text of the Quran, embedding stoning into state-level execution frameworks. The Quran only fact-check. The word stoning rajm never appears in the Quran as a valid divine law. The maximum explicit penalty decreed for publicly witnessed, legally proven adultery is strictly limited to 100 lashes, as documented in Surah An-Nur, chapter 24, verse 2. Crucially, whenever stoning is mentioned narratively in the Quran, it is framed exclusively as a savage extrajudicial tool utilized by pagan tyrants and disbelievers to threaten and silence God's prophets. Abraham's father threatened to stone him in Surah Maryam. The tyrants targeted the companions in Surah Al-Kahf. In the Quran, stoning is the weapon of tyrants, never the law of God. Sixth, mutilation versus societal restraint. The theft penalty. The public amputation of hands and limbs as a punitive measure for property theft continues to be carried out under the legal jurisdiction of strict Sharia courts. In Sahih al-Bukhari, narratives detail the Prophet ordering the physical severing of human hands at the wrist for stealing items of minor material wealth, such as a shield worth a fraction of a dinar. The Quran only fact-check. While Surah Al-Ma'idah chapter 5 verse 38 states, "As for the male thief and the female thief, cut off their hands," a strict linguistic analysis reveals a deeper meaning. The Arabic root word kata is frequently deployed throughout the Quran to mean cutting off access, cutting off capability, or marking, rather than irreversible physical amputation. For example, the women in Surah Yusuf cut their hands in psychological awe of Joseph, yet their limbs remained intact. Reformist scholars argue that under the Quran alone, the divine command is to cut off the thief's capability to steal through structural incarceration, financial restitution, or targeted social rehabilitation. This is heavily reinforced by the immediate, consecutive verse, chapter 5, verse 39, which explicitly voids the punishment if the perpetrator reforms. Beyond specific social codes, broad human rights abuses across the modern globe map directly to this same scriptural divide. In active conflict zones from the Levant to the Horn of Africa, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations and the weaponization of human starvation stand as egregious violations of Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse 32, which states that the unjust taking of a single innocent human life is equivalent to the slaughter of all humanity. In the migrant labor exploitation of the Gulf states, the structural enslavement of millions of foreign workers under the kafala sponsorship system, with wage theft and passport confiscation, is built on corrupt political traditions that the Quran aggressively condemns. And in authoritarian surveillance states across North Africa, the Mediterranean, and South Asia, the mass imprisonment of journalists and the violent suppression of public protest violate the core Quranic mandate of governance via shura, mutual consultation. The foundational argument, utilized by Quran-only proponents to dismantle the factual integrity of the Hadith corpus, rests upon a well-documented historical bottleneck. According to authoritative early Islamic history, including al-Dahabi's biographical record Tadkirat al-Hufaz, the first caliph of Islam, Abu Bakr, collected 500 oral traditions immediately following the Prophet's death and deliberately burned them all due to acute anxiety regarding human transmission errors. Following this event, the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, instituted a strict, empire-wide ban on writing down or transmitting hadiths. Umar issued public decrees commanding the populace to bring forward all existing written hadith journals so they could be set on fire, explicitly fearing that human commentary would compete with, corrupt, or overshadow the text of the Quran. This state-enforced prohibition on compiling hadiths lasted for roughly 100 years, until the reign of Caliph Umar ibn Abdulaziz in the 2nd century Hijri. Quran-only scholars identify this century-long gap as the definitive historical proof of unreliability. They argue that playing a multi-generational, century-long game of oral telephone amidst bloody civil wars and political empires guaranteed the fabrication of traditions to legitimize state tyranny, and the Quran itself declares its own completeness. We have left nothing out of the record, and the word of your Lord has been perfected in truth and justice. None can change his words. The Prophet himself reinforced the same discipline, commanding, "Do not take down anything from me, and whoever took down anything from me other than the Quran, let him efface it." Under the criterion, no human corpus may stand as a rival source of legislation. The most decisive evidence originates within the text itself. The Arabic word hadith simply means a message, a statement, or a report, and the Quran deploys this exact word to describe itself. In Surah Az-Zumar, chapter 39, verse 23, Allah calls the Quran Ahsan al-Hadith, the best message, a book of perfect consistency and repeated lessons. The Quran then poses a challenge that recurs across the text. Surah al-Mursalat, chapter 77, verse 50, so what message, what hadith after this Quran would they believe in? The same refrain returns in Surah al-Jathiyah, chapter 45, and Surah al-Araf, chapter 7. And Surah al-Kalam, chapter 68, verse 44, leave to me those who reject this hadith, this message. In the Quran's own lexicon, the supreme hadith is the Quran itself. The vast medieval corpus that later monopolized this word is a fundamentally different thing. Human narrations, compiled centuries after the fact. The Quran even records the messenger's own warning for the Day of Judgment. Surah Al-Furqan, chapter 25, verse 30, the messenger will cry, "O my Lord, my people have indeed received this Quran with neglect." The prophetic complaint on Judgment Day is not that the community failed to memorize volumes of transmitted traditions. It is that the community abandoned the criterion itself, the Quran. The film bears the name of the very chapter that contains this warning. Al-Furqan, the criterion. Beyond the historical record, specific hadith-based laws directly contradict the explicit text of the Quran. Triple divorce. The Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 229 declares that divorce may be retracted twice, then the husband must retain with honor or release with grace. Yet Sahih Muslim records that 3 divorce pronouncements were counted as a single divorce during the lifetime of the Prophet and his first successor. The change came only later under Umar's caliphate. The instant triple divorce, a practice that has shattered countless families, is a human amendment to divine law. Music. The Quran contains no prohibition of musical instruments. The ban derives exclusively from a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, which lists musical instruments among practices that people will one day deem lawful, and stoning. The hadith corpus claims a verse of stoning once existed, only to be lost when a sheep ate the parchment it was written upon. A penal law built upon the claim of a verse that is not in the Quran. Under the criterion, a law derived from a solitary human report cannot override the explicit text of the Quran. Finally, the hadith corpus itself is the engine of sectarian division. Sunan Abi Dawud records the Prophet predicting that his community would split into 73 sects. This single tradition has been weaponized for centuries to sanctify permanent fragmentation, blessing rival factions that each claim a monopoly on truth. The Quran commands the opposite. Surah Al-Mu'minun, chapter 23, verse 52, surely this religion of yours is one religion, and I am your Lord, so fear me alone. Verse 53, yet the people have divided it into different sects, each rejoicing in what they have. Surah Al-An'am, chapter 6, verse 159, those who divided their faith and split into sects, you are not responsible for them. Surah Ar-Rum, chapter 30, verse 32, condemns the same division. Under the criterion, division is a deviation to be repaired, not a prophecy to be embraced. A frequent challenge leveled against the Quran-only framework by traditionalists is the question of ritual prayer. If Muslims do not follow the Hadith books, how can they know how to pray, given that the step-by-step physical postures are not sequentially detailed in a single verse? The theological response separates the mechanics of prayer into a distinct historical category. First, divine practical demonstration. Prophet Muhammad did not use written or spoken hadiths to learn prayer. He was taught the physical movements of Salah directly through a live demonstration by the angel Gabriel over a 2-day period. Second, mass continuous practice called tawatur. The preservation of prayer did not rely on compiled books or chains of oral narrators. It was preserved through an uninterrupted living global tradition passed down collectively from parents to children. Third, the Abrahamic legacy. The Quran explicitly states that the physical mechanics of bowing, prostrating, and standing were originally revealed to Abraham. The monotheistic communities of Arabia were already fully aware of these physical formats. The Quran did not invent a new physical exercise. It simply corrected, timed, and purified a continuous historical ritual. The Quran establishes a rigid legal and spiritual distinction between a basic follower, a Muslim, and a true believer, a mu'min. Surah Al-Hujurat, chapter 49, verse 14, the desert Arabs say, "We believe." Say, "You do not believe," but say, "We have submitted, for faith has not yet entered your hearts." The Muslim station Islamna represents external, physical, and civic compliance. A person can conform to state laws, sign treaties, and perform outer rituals to be legally recognized as a Muslim by the government. The mu'min station, amana, represents an internal, psychological, and emotional transformation characterized by an intense awe of God, intellectual honesty, and unconditional trust. Because the Quran explicitly dictates that a man's faith is a private psychological evolution that must enter the heart naturally over time, it is impossible for an authoritarian state to create true believers through coercion. A government can use violence to force its citizens to act like Muslims, but it can never force them to be mu'minun. The structural comparison, issue by issue. Grooming, the Hadith framework mandates full beards enforced by state corporal punishment. The Quran-only framework contains 0 grooming laws. Gender autonomy, the Hadith framework restricts female travel without a male handler. The Quran-only framework grants absolute independence to adult women. Freedom of conscience, the Hadith framework commands execution for dissidents. The Quran-only framework enforces a total ban on religious coercion. Capital penalties, the Hadith framework inflicts stoning for adultery. The Quran-only framework rejects execution, identifying stoning as a tool of tyrants. Penal mutilation, the Hadith framework mandates amputation for theft. The Quran-only framework targets the capability to steal via reform. Source of legal authority, the Hadith framework relies on thousands of historically delayed, politically exposed oral reports. The Quran-only framework relies exclusively on a singular, textually immutable divine text, which the Quran itself declares to be the best Hadith. In the final assessment, the Quran defines truth not as a passive, malleable human preference, but as an active, kinetic, and cosmic force known as al-haq, the truth. The text states that the entire physical universe was constructed explicitly upon this force. Surah Al-An'am, chapter 6, verse 73. Because the cosmos is fundamentally wired for truth, any legal system, religious structure, or political regime that builds its empire upon lies, forced compliance, and human rights violations is acting in direct opposition to the laws of nature. The Quran guarantees the absolute structural fragility of institutionalized deception in Surah Al-Anbiya, chapter 21, verse 18. Rather, we dash the truth against falsehood and it crushes it, and at once it vanishes. When evaluated through the objective lens of the Criterion, Al-Furqan, the oppressive apparatus of modern authoritarian regimes is stripped of its divine baseline. By returning to the text of the Quran alone, human reason akal is liberated from the chains of medieval fabrications, restoring the universal human rights, dignity, and absolute freedom of conscience originally decreed by God. The Criterion of Truth, the Quran alone.